Today we're going to be looking at EU social policy and examining whether or not this is the EU market's human face. This is a presentation by Mrs. C. Bradley, Director, Europe Direct, Eastleigh. So the first question to answer is, what is social policy? According to the Lisbon Treaty, EU social policy has as its objectives the promotion of employment, improved living and working conditions, proper social protection, dialogue between management and labour, and the development of human resources with a view to lasting high employment and the combating of exclusion. According to the Lisbon Treaty, the Union and the Member States will have in mind fundamental social rights, such as those set out in the European Social Charter signed at Turin on the 18th of October 1961, and those rights set out in the 1989 Community Charter of the Fundamental Social Rights of Workers. The origins of EU social policy. When the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957, the 6 founding members were primarily focused on creating a common market. There was little concern given to social policy issues. However, it did come to be recognised that in order for the common market to work, workers had to be able to move freely. In terms of its historical context, the main focus of the founding countries was to deal with the economic problems that existed after the end of the Second World War. Social policy was also not included in the original Treaty of Rome, as the French and Germans had very different views on the role, structures and cultural importance of social policy, and their views at that time were irreconcilable. However, the Treaty of Rome did say that if some measure of social policy was required to achieve an economic objective, then the Council could take action, which however required unanimity amongst the Member States. Because of this requirement for unanimity, social policy was gridlocked for a number of years. The European Commission got round this problem by not treating social policy as social policy. Instead, they tried introducing and coordinating social measures as a byproduct of the free movement rules. This meant allowing workers to take their benefits, such as pension rights, with them. It also prevented social discrimination in the member states to which they moved. Between 1957 and 1987, progress on EU social policy was very slow because of this requirement for unanimity. Also, EU social policy was limited to lifting restrictions on workers specifically. Directive 68/360 clarified the formal requirements relating to the rights of entry and residence of non-nationals and created a system of residence permits for EU nationals who were working in other EU member states. Further developments. 1979 saw a directive enacted which intended to prevent the discrimination of workers from other EC countries in national social security systems. Subsequently, in 1986, 2 more directives were passed which provided for equal treatment for men and women in the realm of occupational social security and self-employment. In time, social issues were perceived as becoming ever more central to the future of the community. In 1987, the Single European Act, which led to the creation of the single market, marked a significant advance as member states were interested in further deepening economic integration. However, in 1987, the Single European Act was established as the first major revision of the Treaty of Rome, and this Single European Act introduced qualified majority voting. While the economy remained the primary concern for the revision, social policy was beginning to gain ground as an important issue to the future of the European Economic Community. The Single European Act introduced qualified majority voting to a number of areas, including health and safety of workers. For the first time, member states could be forced to accept some provision, even if it was against their noted objections. Prior to the Single European Act, some health and safety legislation had been passed, but usually only if it did not conflict with national law provisions and policy. Following the Single European Act, new measures were geared towards harmonising national social policy regimes. These included special protection for workers who were pregnant, breastfeeding, as well as young workers. The intention was to protect workers that were most likely to work in another member state, such as those in the construction sector and in services. Other important social changes at EU level. Another directive forced employers to notify their employees regarding intended changes of the employment relationship, Directive 91/533/EC. Also, the Working Time Directive called for break periods for workers during their shifts, for weekly days off, and also yearly vacation time. The Community Charter of Social Rights for Workers. When the Single European Act went into effect, it had cascading consequences in many other policy areas. The Community Charter of Social Rights was one of the most important subsequent developments, which was proposed by the Commission in 1989. It also meant that from that moment on, social policy dialogue was present in all single market matters. Whilst the Social Charter was initially only a declaration of principles that applied to workers only, and not all citizens of the EEC, it was a very important step in the development of European social policy. For the first time, social policy was elevated to a level equal to the economic matters in the European community. The success of the single market was perceived as being dependent on social policy. The Maastricht Treaty included the European Social Charter in its original instance, but this was blocked by the British veto. Britain opted out of the Social Charter. However, the Maastricht Treaty included 4 landmark changes. The Commission was granted the power to create a dialogue between social partners, which proved vital for creating a framework for European social policy negotiation. Some areas of social policy were opened up to qualified majority voting in the Council. This allowed for advances in policy by having a means of overcoming the constant deadlock in the form of a member veto. Usually it has to be said a British veto. Article 13 EC provided that the Council, after consulting the European Parliament, may take appropriate action to combat discrimination based on sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age, or sexual orientation. This meant that social policy was no longer limited to workers, but was extended to cover certain categories of people that needed protecting from certain types of discrimination. The role of the European Court of Justice. In the evolution of EU social policy, the European Court of Justice has played a critical role and continues to do so. The Treaty of Rome contained some social policy provisions that were either not operative and merely a declaratory statement, such as equal pay for men and women, or subject to very different interpretations by the member states. The European Court of Justice, by giving force to these dormant clauses in the treaty and by providing authoritative interpretations, imposed supranational harmonisation over nationally instituted welfare regimes. A famous example of this is found in the European Court of Justice ruling regarding Articles 119 and 120, which provided equal work and vacation pay for men and women. The outcome of the Dufresne case led to the creation of the Equal Pay Directive. In the following year, the directive was extended to all employment conditions pertaining to the sexes. 1979 saw a directive enacted which intended to prevent the discrimination of workers from other EC countries' national social security systems. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Union. This enshrines certain political, social and economic rights for EU citizens and residents into EU law. It was proclaimed on the 7th of December 2000 but did not have full legal effect until the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon. The UK and Poland secured an opt-out to the Charter and the Czech Republic was also opposed to it. EU citizenship. The concept of EU citizenship was introduced by the Treaty of Maastricht. Citizenship means that every person who is a citizen of a member state, i.e. one of the 28 countries of Europe, is automatically a citizen of the EU. EU citizenship does not replace national citizenship, but instead confers on EU citizens additional rights. So what rights do you have as an EU citizen? You have the right to move and reside freely within the EU. You have the right to vote for and stand as a candidate in EU elections. You have the right to be protected by the diplomatic and consular authorities of any EU country. And you have the right to petition the European Parliament and complain to the European Ombudsman. You are also entitled, by right, to contact an EU institution and receive a response in one of the EU's official languages. You have the right to access European Parliament, European Commission and Council documents. You have a right of equal access to the EU civil service, and the treaty also prohibits discrimination on the grounds of nationality. Where can I find details of my citizens' rights? You can find details of your citizens' rights at http://Europa, which is EUROPA.eu, all lowercase, /Your Europe. Solvit is another good organisation to know about. It helps citizens uphold their citizenship rights. So if you are having a problem enforcing your rights, then you can take the matter up with Solvit and they will contact the public authority who's preventing you from exercising your rights and aim to resolve the situation. And that service is free of charge. If you'd like to find out more information on this, the web address where you can find it is http://ec.europa.eu/solvit, solvit/site/about/index_en.htm. Europe Direct also helps inform citizens of their rights, and if you'd like further information on this, you can go to http://www.europedirect-eastleigh.org.uk. Therefore, while social policy has been there since the beginning, there was very little development of social policy from 1957 to 1987 due to the requirement for such measures to be agreed to unanimously. What progress there was limited to the abolition of restrictions on workers' rights only. The next key period was 1987 to 2007. During this period, social policy was perceived as an essential component in the development of the single market. Social policy was also no longer limited to workers' rights, but also protected certain categories of people from discrimination. Since the Treaty of Lisbon, free movement rights have been linked to citizenship rights. This means that EU social policy is not limited to categories of people, but in fact it affects everybody who's a citizen of the EU. Know your rights. It's taken 60 years of political bickering, judicial activism by the European Court of Justice, and the development of human rights in the wider world for these rights to be created and development. Given how hard it's been to earn them, make